today we welcome Paul McGarry from Manchester, England. Manchester is a major city in the northwest of England with a rich industrial heritage. And Paul is the head of Greater Manchester Ageing Hub of the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. And they are tasked with making Greater Manchester the UK's first age-friendly city region. Now, I was interested to learn that the vision of the authority is for Greater Manchester to be a place where everyone can live a good life, growing up, getting on, growing older in a greener, fairer, more prosperous city region. So, Paul, for nearly 20 years, you've led the Age Friendly Manchester program at the Manchester City Council, which was formerly called Valuing Older People. And under your leadership, there have been many achievements, and you're world renowned for those achievements. One of them being Manchester became the first UK city to achieve WHO age-friendly status and was a founding member of both the WHO's global network of age-friendly cities and communities and the UK network of age-friendly cities. So, Paul, welcome to our IFA's Global Café. And my first question to you is, tell us a little bit about Manchester, where you've spent much of your life, personally and professionally. What does it look like and feel like as a city?
Well, Manchester, the city of Manchester, which is a kind of centre of the Greater Manchester conurbation. Greater Manchester's close to 3 million people, 10 local authorities. The city in which I've lived more or less continuously since I was 18, I'm 60 this year, so that's quite a long time, it was the first modern capitalist city. It's birthplace of arguably the computer, splitting the atom, many other things, the modern trade union movement, human rights organisations, lesbian and gay organisations here in the UK. It's a kind of radical city. It's an ever-changing city. It's a migrant city. My wife is, for example, is a head teacher in a local school, and I think there are up to 30 languages spoke from around the world in the school. So it's an exciting place, and the city itself is a young city, which is one of the kind of ironies or paradoxes about the work that I do. And it's a cultural city. It's known for its music. It's a football or a soccer city. You know, one of the world's most famous football clubs, I guess, here. And
I'll find out what the issue is and see if we can.
So it's an incredible place, really, and it's an exciting place to live and work. And the Greater Manchester is the city that has is a city region, I say, close to 3 million people. We have a wide range of rural, semi-rural, urban areas, and it's just a great place to work. You know, I feel I'm kind of 90% Mancunian now, I guess.
Yes,
10% from where I grew up.
Yes, you called it a young city, and that leads me to ask the question: why a young city, and how do you, in your work, really define age-friendly? Because we do have the WHO definition, but there seems to be a bit of a tension. If this is a young city and you're in the field of age-friendly, what do we really mean by this?
Well, I think you need to kind of, I need to explain, I suppose, where we came from to understand our work. And I started work on ageing. I don't think I wrote my first policy or action plan around ageing in something like 1997. So, and actually the issues in there were around poverty, transport, social isolation, housing, all the things that we still work on now. And I think at that point, Manchester is a young city. It's also although it's changed a lot over the last generation. It's always been a poor city, it's a migrant city and so on. And it was a city at that point that was undergoing lots of urban development under New Labour, following Tony Blair's election in 1997. So there were huge investments in the city region, in the city itself, in the inner city areas. And one of the things that I felt was missing was really any kind of narrative or focus on the position of older people in the city. Most of the programs, and this was something nationally about some of these national programs. They didn't have a focus on older people. They didn't have anything around aging in terms of narrative or anything like that. And a large part of my work has always been about hanging out with, I suppose it's kind of ethnographic, isn't it? Just hanging out where older people are, finding out what's going on. And I think through doing that in parts of the city rather, I just discovered a whole set of issues which I think weren't part of the city's story at that point, or its priorities. So this all predates the age-friendly movement work and concept work by quite some time. Around about 2009-10, we were trying to work out what to do with this program of work, which was really focused on inner city areas and low income areas. And the WHO approach and the language and the endorsement as ever from WHO, we felt was a really useful tool for us and a framework for us. It was a way of talking about our work, which people could understand. And so we kind of have a version of, we had our own version of the age-friendly city or age-friendly work, which was in particular based at a neighbourhood and community level as well. And I think, as you hinted at, there are numerous versions, flavours, I guess, of the age-friendly brand. And some of those are because of the people who lead them. So in America, AARP plays a significant role, and that's slightly different to the work that perhaps is done in the UK. It will be different to the work that's done in some low-income countries and so on, and certainly in Canada as well, where academic organisations have played such an important role. So for us, I think the age-friendly work means two things, essentially. One, it means addressing the issues of that older people face now, of social exclusion. We use social exclusion as a key concept and organising principle. And secondly, of preparing for the next decade or 2 decades and trying to connect those two things together. And I think so that the age-friendly concept means that for us, I think. It's about social justice, it's about inclusion, it's about agency, leadership, it's about challenging ageism.
It's interesting that you actually threaded through, social justice, when there's such conversations about the rights of older people. I want to fast track you now, Paul, and ask you to talk about this GM Aging Hub. Now, I don't think I can underestimate, what this means to have a Greater Manchester Aging Hub. What's its roots? What's its origins? How did it come to be?
Well, the driving force behind it was the development of devolution in England. So, we have devolved parliaments and so on in Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland. But part of what's happened in Greater Manchester over the last decade is devolution of certain powers around transport and housing, work and skills, to a Greater Manchester Authority. And the authority, as you might recognise it now, really came into significance in about 2016-17. And those of us that were interested in the ageing agenda recognised or identified that there wasn't really a story around population change and population ageing, or whatever you want to call it, in that Greater Manchester framework. And it, myself and colleagues in public health in research, Chris Phillipson at University of Manchester, who you'll know, and others got together to think about, well, how can we move things onto a Greater Manchester footing? Because the city region is big enough, I think, to do things at scale, but it's also small enough to be able to do things. So the roots were in the work that we'd been doing in Manchester since the mid-90s, connecting with other partners in Greater Manchester. And in 2016, the Combined Authority met in a meeting in Rochdale and agreed to set up the Ageing Hub. And part of that was a partnership agreement with the Centre for Ageing Better, which is a What Works centre here in the UK, and plays a very important role, and has been a kind of sibling of ours. So the hub is started off as me and one other colleague and a range of different activities. And I guess now there's, I think by kind of April of this year, there'll be something like 10 of us in the core team. Outside of that, a whole series of associates, wider team structures, task groups across a range of different topics, and various programs and so on. So the Ageing Hub is this platform. It's a multi-agency platform. Sometimes it's, they call the quadruple helix. So the voice of public services, research, business to a certain extent, and older residents, and combining those in a kind of, I think in the UK, a unique platform around ageing, certainly at a city regional level.
And it speaks also to the length of time that something like GM Ageing Hub takes to put together, and that moment in time where you almost have your planets aligned with government interest, demographics, your academics, your industry coming together. I'm just going to now turn to ask you a question from Shmuel. Shmuel is an absolute regular on our global cafes every single week, and he asks the first question, and I think it's a good question. Can you give Shmuel and us an example of age-friendly environment projects in GM that can support the improvement of social and economic well-being of those in poor and low socioeconomic populations? Can you give us a sense of how age-friendly can support, those population groups?
Sure. I think our journey, I mean, I don't like using that term, but I guess it's just, I can't think of a better one, right? Our journey, if you like, on improving neighbourhoods or making neighbourhoods more age-friendly. I think about 20 years ago, in about 2004, by accident, actually. One of my colleagues, who's now a senior colleague in the Age Friendly Manchester team that I used to manage, rang me up one day and said, "Look, Paul, we're going to get a group of local officers from different agencies together in an electoral ward just north of the city centre, which was and continues to have social and economic challenges, to talk about how we can collaborate in this place to make it a better place for older people." And that model of a kind of neighbourhood network, which is not unique at all to Manchester, but was new to us at the time, developed over, I would say, till about 2010. And we have, 15 of these local networks across the city. People working at a neighbourhood level with older people, talking about what happens in their community and how things can be improved. And that developed into a whole series of initiatives since then. So some of them research-led, partnership-led. Our Old Moat project in the south of the cities was our first real go at it, I think. We got something like £11 million from the UK Lottery to fund a programme called Ambition for Ageing, which was, I think, in 25 Greater Manchester neighbourhoods using the age-friendly model over 7 years. And then our most recent initiative is our Ageing in Place Pathfinder, which is in 8 Greater Manchester neighbourhoods, exploring how we use the naturally occurring retirement community model. And in all of these, there's a similar DNA, and the DNA is we work with older people from a range of different backgrounds in places. We identify what's important to them, and we work with them to improve their lives in the way that they sees the most important. And you do that by collaboration and co-production and all those things. And yeah, I'll tell you just one small story which I think illustrates that, and some of the tensions around our work as well in terms of language and so on. Which is, I was in a Methodist church once with a group of older residents. I was asking them, this is about 2005, I think, six, asking them what would make their lives better. And they said, you know, Paul, we love going to the cinema, but we can't go. It's too expensive. It's too far away and so on. So they used the local community centre to set up something called a front row club. They got a license to show contemporary films and movies. And over time, this front row club became actually a social centre, which organised physical activity, talks from local health professionals. The local library would come in and give a talk about it. And it built up into a centre for the local older population to meet and enjoy life. Now, I've told this story many times, and I told it to a room full of health and social care professionals once. And they said, you know, Paul, what a great story of a preventative project. And, you know, it is on one level, you know, it is. But, you know, we kind of pathologize older age by calling things prevention sometimes. The reason this works is because older people enjoyed seeing films in the way that you or I would do. And when you and I go to the cinema, we don't really call it preventative interventions. We just call it a better life, like it says in our Greater Manchester Strategy. So I think we've done an enormous amount of this over many, many years. And I think I know what it takes to be successful. The problem is, and over the last decade, for sure, you know, austerity as in UK politics and nationally and internationally has taken its toll on the investments on the kind of nice to do things. And quite often our work, I think, is seen as a nice to do.
I'm fascinated with that phrase. We pathologize older age with this term prevention, and absolutely, yes, we do. Before I ask you another one of my questions, I'm going to turn to Jane Teasdale, who's the CEO of Mosaic. So Jane, welcome. Please come forward and ask Paul your question.
Yes, Paul, I'm finding this very interesting. In Manchester, I was just wondering, do you have many squares within Manchester where people are coming together, young and old, the older population? And are there many pedestrian areas where walkable areas and friendly benches where people can sit? I do know in Toronto, this is something that we lack here. Hopefully we're going to be getting better, but that's what I notice when I go to Europe. And also your point on, I would say, community hubs. This is what Mosaic has created within Toronto. And I find that a lot of community agencies now are going into spiritual centers and churches and developing social programs and connectedness. So I just want to hear your answer on those questions.
Well, there's a whole literature, isn't there, on squares, on their use and making good squares as well. I remember having a colleague, I forget which organisation or which academic organisation she was from, and we were walking around the main square in the city of Manchester, which is Albert Square, just outside, adjacent to City Hall, I guess you'd call it. And she was looking at the square from the eye of somebody who studies squares across the world, and telling me what was good about it and not so good about it. And we're just redeveloping it now. It's been pedestrianised at the moment, actually. And there are lots of squares across Greater Manchester, often linked to the big civic town halls that were built, many of them in the kind of late Victorian age. You know, these were kind of these were expressions of civic power by the Victorian capitalist entrepreneurs, you know, who were the wealthy, who were the kind of had the wealth at the time, and still do, arguably. And there are other squares as well. There's a new square in the city centre outside one of our new cultural institution called Home. And these are places absolutely for a part of our social infrastructure. You know, the problem we have in Manchester, I don't know Toronto, I've never been to Toronto, but the problem we have in Manchester is that it rains a lot. And it's well known for that. So we have to be careful, you know, and there's been some great work here by our colleagues at Manchester University. Sophie York, actually, just got reading the book earlier on, it's a wonderful book here on social infrastructure and its importance. And you're right to point out the role of faith and religious spaces as well. And partly because they are places where people meet, but partly as I guess I describe myself as 80% bureaucrat and 20% sociologist. You know, the bureaucrat in City Hall needs to find ways to have discussions, to build relationships with different groups of people, and that religious and faith spaces are an important part of that that equation, I think. So yeah, yeah. I mean, when I was younger, I loved the idea of this of the city square being. I just haven't thought about it much recently. I think it's because I used to work in City Hall and now I don't. I don't know. I'm not sure.
Okay, Paul, we've got lots of questions, so I'm going to keep moving forward with the questions and then loop back to you. So we're going to go forward with Dominic, Danielle, and then Paul. So Dominic Boyd, would you like to, really important question, Dominic, you there?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, very well.
Yeah, so just briefly, Paul, I'm interested to know how you guys address what we would call intersectionality, where people who are old come from diverse backgrounds, such as, you know, different colored skin, different ethnicity, language, immigration status, certainly affects their social determinants of health. And so I'm curious to know if you've been able to address those particular areas of concern.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, good question. I mean, I'll try and answer these things as quickly as possible because that's a whole session, isn't it? So, okay, I'll give you one example of how we do that. When we set up the Age-Friendly Manchester Older People's Board, it wasn't called that originally, but when we set it up, we ensured that all of the different groups of identity, gender, sex, and so on and so forth were represented in some way. And so, for example, we have a representative of the lesbian, gay, etc. Community. We have a LGBT plus program called Pride in Aging. We're just about to build an LGBT plus social housing development in South Manchester for older adults. Around ethnicity, you know, as I said, we're a migrant city, so it's a big job for us. But we spent a lot of work developing relationships and trust through a series of programs and working with minority ethnic communities. We have a neighbourhood network which brings together at a GM and a Manchester level all those communities. We do work around gender, sex, and so on. And we work closely with disabled people's organisations. So it's absolutely core. I don't think I've missed anything there. I'm sure you can remind me if I've. I think it's an absolutely core element of our work. It's also challenging as well, you know, because we're in a world where everybody wants to have their voice heard, and quite rightly too. But actually, a large part of the practice of age-friendly work is building common ground with people from different communities and different backgrounds around common aims. So that's absolutely core to what we do.
Thanks, Paul. We go to Danielle Goodman and then to Paul Burton. Danielle?
Good morning. Please, could you describe the aging in place pathfinder that you mentioned before?
Sure. Okay. So the Pathfinders I kind of suggested is the latest chapter, I suppose, in our neighbourhood scale working that's been going for 20 years. Some of it funded, some of it not funded. As you might not be surprised, a lot of this work is kind of stop-start because it's based on the resources that we can find. So this particular project is based on a North American, you know, the naturally occurring retirement community intervention commonplace in some North American cities and in Toronto, I believe, and in other parts of Canada. And we're developing, it's a 4-year program.
Yeah, we've got you back again.
Got me back. So the population size is typically 10 to 20,000, I would say. Some a bit smaller, some a bit bigger. And we have an evaluation partner and a strategic partner with Manchester School of Architecture. So we look at the spatial dimensions, we look at the power dimensions, we look at the agency, we look at issues around transport design, all the kind of age-friendly themes, how they operate, intertwine in these places. And our objective is to sustain. We had a session yesterday, how we sustain and scale these initiatives over time. So that's the Aging in Place Pathfinder. If there isn't anything on our website, Joe, who's my colleague from our team, can put a link, I'm sure, on in the chat. But it is our flagship program at the moment.
Okay, thanks, Paul, and we thank Joe for being with us today. So, Paul Burton, you've got a great question. I'm interested to hear Paul's perspective on this.
Very much. So it's just good to see you, Paul.
Hiya.
I'm from Trafford, which is one of 10 local authorities within Greater Manchester. So I have the pleasure of hearing from Paul on a regular basis, and it's wonderful. We've got such a knowledgeable and experienced practitioner in the Greater Manchester area. Just noting that Wales has a dedicated older person commissioner for their area. I just wondered to what extent you felt the GM approach and others like it would be complemented by the appointment of an older persons commissioner for England.
Well, I mean, it's actually been a topic that's been knocking around for 15 years, I think. Possibly started under New Labour. New Labour, under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, had a older people's lead person whose name is John Bakewell. So there was a kind of, it was a famous actress, journalist. So I agree. I think the problem we have here in England, Wales is different. Scotland has its own arrangements as well. Actually, Scotland's not been as strong, I don't think, on this agenda in the last few years for various reasons. But there's no national strategy on ageing in the UK. And what the impact of that is, and so there's no commissioner, and the impact of that is that local authorities, NHS organisations, housing organisations and others don't feel accountable or don't feel that they have to demonstrate that they're delivering on a national strategy. I've been doing this work where there was a national strategy and far more people were involved. There's some great work in the 2000s by the Audit Commission here in the UK and other organisations, Cabinet Office, Better Government for Older People. Wonderful initiatives, and since 2010-11, nothing really.
Well, I think that says it all, doesn't it, Paul?
Yeah.
I just want to go back to the GM Aging Hub. You've mentioned a couple of times, the problem that we all share, lack of funding and insignificance, particularly in times of austerity. If you were standing in front of government today, what is your elevator pitch for the GM Aging Hub, and also to industry? What's your business case when you go and talk with them?
Yeah, I mean, just the first thing I want to say is that the vast majority of our funding actually comes from philanthropy, charities and think tanks, and a minority of funding for the core team comes from governmental sources. So there's a kind of interesting issue there, isn't there, for us? So I think what's the elevator pitch? I think there's kind of 3 or 4 elements to it. I think the first thing is, look, the demographics tell their own story. You put the graph up. This is what's happening, and it's a challenge. Everybody, you challenge. People think this is a bad thing, except when you talk to them, actually, it's a good thing that you're going to live and we're all going to live longer. So the demographics tell their own story. So you then have to, I think, from a GM perspective, say, look, we've delivered over 20 years large-scale programs of change £25 million, I think we've probably attracted to Manchester and Greater Manchester over probably the last 10, 15 years alone, just to fund these initiatives. And that the hub is a unique collaboration. You know, we have this intersection of research, international researchers, leading researchers, international clinicians like Martin Vernon, political leaders like Andy Burnham, who's one of the best known politicians here in the UK. And as I said before, the city region is big enough to scale things, but it's small enough to make things happen. In terms of industry, you're on the front foot in terms of the opportunity of aging populations. We've been doing lots of work with industry over many, many years. I think it's tough though, you know, and I suspect that as I mentioned elsewhere, I think the next wave of innovation in aging will probably come from the private sector. I think it's happening now. Because they have the business interests, they understand, broadly speaking, the opportunities. I think the danger is that those of us who've been in this work for a long time at risk of being pushed aside a little by those new innovators come along, and that may be a good or a bad thing. But and I think the other thing is that there will be a less of a focus on inequalities in a range of different ways, if those innovations are led essentially by the need to make money. So, the elevator pitch is that we're a leading organisation. This is an international issue. We need to find ways to plan for ageing populations and to grow our economy, and that's, I think, what it is. Well, what I would say, it's what I've been saying for the last 10 years, and we've made some progress. So, but any help with that, I'd be more than welcome.
Well, you know, the point that you make about, you know, multinationals, you know, getting the idea that this is a growing business, as I've been saying for the last 40 years, you know, there is a danger of the experts and expertise being pushed aside, you know, to actually scale up quickly.
Yeah.
And in saying that, I want to talk to you about the mechanics of co-designing. And I know that your colleague Tina has done a lot of work in that area.
Yeah.
Very often, you know, we sit on committees and we go, oh, where's the older person? Or we need to have an older person's council because that will then help us inform. And yet we really know in real life that what they're saying is perhaps not legitimized in the program or policy development. So talk with us a little bit about this co-designing with older people.
Yeah, well, you're right. And Tina Buffle, my Professor Buffle now at University of Manchester, is a great partner of ours, and we work together, and I'm a member of the research group as well when I have some spare time. So I think co-production is something that I think 20 years ago, I'm not sure it was a word we used. I don't know when it started, but I want to start 20 years ago in a way, because when we set up our first older people's committee, I think it took, which was drawn from all parts of the city of Manchester, and we have similar now in GM. I think it takes 2 or 3 years to build effective, trustworthy, trustful relationships with groups of people like that. So it's based on trust and relationships, and you have to do that. And as you know, that was very clear, and that's what I learned. I think as practitioners, we have to go and hang out where older people are. We can't just do it in formal ways. We have to look what the research tells us. We have to collect information and data from a range of sources and create spaces and places with different groups of older people to tell their stories. Sometimes that's just one person's story which can have the biggest impact. So we have to, it is like, I guess, you know, we've mentioned somebody from Mosaic been on the call. There is a kind of mosaic of information, and how you present that information at the most senior level, but also how you present that information at a neighbourhood level. And I think what I would reflect on over the last 20 or 30 years is that the barrier, if that's the right term, between myself as an officer and those of the older people that I've worked with over that time, you know, or the distinction is sometimes hard to spot, you know, and that's, I think, where you feel you're making. I've got long-term relationships with older people who are activists who've done this work, and I think one of the you can't do the co-production over 12 months or 2 years. You have to think about 5 and 10 years, I think, for this kind of thing.
And you've mentioned hanging out, you know, a lot. And I
Yeah.
like that kind of scenario, hanging out in the square. I want to
Yeah.
talk with you about terminology, which is so critically important.
Mm.
Now, you know, UN Decade of Healthy Aging and the 4 action areas and the 4 enablers, but I've noticed that GM Aging Hub, you know, sometimes uses this word creative. And I just want to know where that comes from and what's the value and how do you use it?
Well, the creative thing, I guess, as a theme of our work, I started off 20 years ago. So the city of Manchester, when I was the city of Manchester, as the kind of downtown area, it's where you've got a proliferation of cultural institutions, big, well-funded, at that point, certainly, cultural institutions. But actually, there were 2 problems with them from our perspective. One is that their programs and their initiatives tended to be dominated by children, young people, and families, as they were called, still are to a certain extent. But also, lots of these institutions were cheek and jowl with the poorest older people who lived in that kind of donut just around the city centre, the downtown areas, I suppose. So we built up over, I think, a 5-year period, I'm thinking now, a partnership, a cultural and creative partnership on ageing, which brought together 20 odd cultural and creative organisations, from small music venues to the City Art Gallery. And all of them, to a lesser or greater extent, started to develop initiatives which were aimed at people on low incomes, in low income areas, not just so. One of my favourite ones is the city orchestra, the Halle Orchestra, named after a German migrant in the 19th century, invited a group of older people that had never been to a performance to sit in with the orchestra as it rehearsed with the director, and he explained what was going on, and then they came in the evening for the performance, or actually to a matinees, because they started putting on matinees because the older people said they preferred that. So we have a lot of programs, culture champions, where older people are kind of interlockers between cultural institutions and neighbourhoods. You know, there's an enormous program there, and you know, even things like nightclubs. So we have an over 60s nightclub called My Generation in the city centre, and this came from a request from some of our older residents. You know, we don't want to go to tea dances, Paul. Please, thank you very much. We want to dance to the Rolling Stones and the Beatles and so on. So we were able to get a nightclub in the city centre on Sunday nights when it's quiet, and yeah, indeed, they don't call it Manchester for nothing. So this was partly a kind of emblematic project to say to the city itself, don't forget older people, don't forget the grey pound, if you want to call it that. And that people, you know, people are in their 70s and 80s now with the hippies and the mods and rockers that, you know, not very long ago.
Gee, the mods and rockers.
So the cultural creative work is amazing. I love it. I'm actually chair of a national charity called the Creative Ageing Development Agency, which has been set up to promote creative ageing in later life.
Yeah, look, you take me back to my teenagers by talking about mods and rockers.
Yeah.
I want to acknowledge those that have been making comment in the chat box, you know, Brendan, Polly, Sharon, so thank you. I want to go back to the model, Paul, because you do have a very important partnership agreement with the Centre of Ageing Better. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. And at the same time, I want to acknowledge a very fine and good colleague who's on the line today, Kathy Garner. Hi, Kathy. Great memories of us in Ottawa. So, Paul, is this model being used in other regions? And what makes this model work?
the relationship with the Centre for Aging Better,
Yeah. Yeah.
So when the centre was established around about 15, 16, the first things that I did was go to London to have a conversation with the then chief executive and chair, and they came to Manchester and Greater Manchester to listen about the work we were doing. And it was a kind of love at first sight, hopefully anyway. And so we've been working with them since then on a range of initiatives around older workers. We'd set up the the age-friendly network in Manchester, the national one, in 2012. We couldn't run it effectively from our small team, and we had about 10 cities involved, and they took that on. It's now got over 50 affiliates here in the UK, and I sit on the steering group. But the relationship was really, a national organisation working out through local implementation at a policy level and at an implementation level, what its national initiatives meant. So I said older workers, healthy aging, work on housing and so on. And we've done local initiatives which they've funded or part funded over the last few years. They have a similar relationship with the City of Leeds, who do fantastic work, particularly around neighbourhood networks. And they have a partnership with Lincoln, which is a small market town, to develop a kind of rural gaze. So the partnership with the centre, we wouldn't have been able to do what we've done at the GM level without the Centre for Aging Better. Because once you've got one investor, if you want to call it that, you can then go out and get other colleagues to invest. So we're developing a similar relationship with Independent Age, which is another UK charity, and with other investors. So there are Aging in Place pathfinders from a philanthropic investor, which was in part, I think, supported by our relationship with Centre for Aging Better. So it's I think having a national centre of excellence is important, and you need to build other centres of excellence in our big urban areas as well.
And I just want to acknowledge Anna Sangster and Matali Mistry and Kira Cruz from the IFA team, who are supporting through the Global Network of Age-Friendly Cities and Communities, the Secretariat, and their links to the Centre of Aging Better. All right, so Paul, we'll advance 5 years and we're 2028. What's the legacy of the Greater Manchester Aging Hub when we're sitting here in 2028? I won't be sitting here, but anyway, when you're sitting here in 2028.
I don't know whether will I be sitting here in 2028. It's a good question. I'll be 65. So I think one of the things about aging, those of us involved in aging, it's not kind of it's an assumption you just keep going, isn't it? I think. You're not allowed to retire, I don't think. And I love what I do. I mean, it's a kind of great. Okay, I'll try and answer your question. I think what would it be? I think in 2028, Greater Manchester will be a international centre of excellence on ageing policy, strategy, research and implementation. And we have plans to do that. We're working on plans now for a physical centre and for a number of programmes with a number of partners. I think we will have developed a new wave of leaders. I've got a great set of staff now, and in academia, almost exclusively female as well, I should say. So we've got this wave of clever, committed, brilliant women that I think will be the next wave of leaders in our work. And when our city elders and leaders stand up to talk about, to sell the city and to reflect on the city story, they talk about our work in ageing as being part of that city narrative, along with industry, culture, football, and all the rest. So I think that's where I'd like to be in 2028. I think the last thing I would like, sorry, I should say this, is that we have a flourishing older people's movement, self-organised older people's movement, because that is one of the big weaknesses in the UK. We don't have that in the UK. I think like you've got in some of the Northern European countries and North American.
So in 2028, will the demographics have shifted? We talked about the City of Manchester being a young population or young city.
Yeah.
So I guess we would expect there to be changes there also.
Yeah, and we've just got the latest census information.
So Bruno, what we may do while Paul picks up is we'll shift to talk about our next week's Global Cafe, if that's all right with everybody. So apologies for that glitch, but I'm sure that Paul's going to be coming back. Next week, I will have the great pleasure of talking with Dr. Suzanne Dupuy-Blanchard. Now, Suzanne is well known to all of those people in the international field of ageing and population ageing, with particular interest in long-term care, care of the elderly and ageing in place. So Suzanne was also one of those people in 2022 who received the award of one of the 50 healthy ageing experts in the world. So she'll be talking with us about fostering healthy ageing and at home. And I think what we do with these conversations every week is not only do we gain a greater understanding and in-depth knowledge of the field, but we also get the opportunity to talk to the person. And that's going to be of critical importance. So how are we going, Bruna? Paul will be back in a few minutes.
Yes, as soon as he's back, I'll let you know. Yes, hasn't been back yet.
So let me just make a few sort of closing comments. What I talk away from this is that this is a long road, that Paul's work and the work of his colleagues, throughout the Greater Manchester area has taken some considerable time. I think he mentioned 1993. And so this is not a fast process, but it's a process that really calls for, a cross-section and cross-discipline approach. And of course, that there needs to be trusted relationships. And Paul talked about, at least 2 to 3 years. He talked about Manchester region being a region where, human rights, it is radical. It's a migrant city. It's a young city. It's a musical city. It's a cultural city. It's a city where in the 1990s, they really spoke to the issues of poverty, transport, social isolation, housing, and social justice. And those very issues that were talked about in the 1990s and into the 2000s, are with us today. The model, the link with and the support of the Centre for Ageing Better has been instrumental for the evolution of Greater Manchester and the GM Ageing Hub. Paul talked about the ageing in place pathways, and he talked about the work with older people being the DNA of the GM Ageing Hub, and several reflections about neighbourhoods. He talked about the naturally occurring retirement community, Norks, but also, the neighbourhood work that's been done in Leeds. The issue of austerity was raised a number of times, and the importance of being able to draw on different sources of funding. But he certainly made the point that the main sources of funding, certainly comes from philanthropic areas, think tanks, also foundations, and some from government. Going forward into 2028, demographics will tell the story. GM Ageing Hub will be and continue to be a leading organisation, not only in England, UK, but around the world. And there'll be a growing call for expertise. I particularly liked, a couple of comments about, hanging out with people. And I think not only hanging out with older people, but just hanging out with people is something that we don't do as much now as we did, previously. I think another key element that Paul talked about is one person's story can make the difference. So that's my summation of the conversation that I've had with Paul today. You there with us, Paul?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Well, I've just synthesized what I've heard from our conversation today, but it would be really important and helpful for you to give us your 3 takeaway messages, and then I'll take the floor back and just remind everybody of our global conference. So, Paul, it's been inspiring, comforting, and I feel like I really have been sitting around a coffee table having a cup of tea. So, Paul, what are your takeaway messages for us today?
I love the term comforting, Jane, and I think we said earlier, those of us in this world don't get enough chances to talk about our practice as, I guess, as leaders or organisers in the ageing world. I think the three things. I think the first one is, you know, the world that we operate in. You know, sometimes you're hot and sometimes you're not, in terms of people being interested in your agenda. Frankly, you know, sometimes the pendulum swings away from you for a while, and other things become important to policymakers, to investors, and so on. And even when that happens, use your time wisely, because you will get, people will come back to you and be interested in your work. So use your time wisely, build relationships, spend time at events like this, and make sure you're the best informed person in the room, or that you're working with the best informed people in the room, which is essentially what I've tried to do in my work, is get the smartest, hardest working people to surround you. The second one is aging isn't going away, you know, and those of us in the age-friendly world need to be prepared for the changes that are going to come in terms of policy making, in terms of the private sector, and to use our time wisely in developing relationships with those people who are going to be making decisions, not least people who are younger than us as well. And I think the last thing, indeed, patience, but never give up as well. I think the last thing is, you know, it's a great career. I never really thought of myself as having a career. You know, I just went to work. But recently, I've kind of realised that I've had a career of 30 years, I guess, in this kind of stuff. And it's a great career. I think sometimes people think, oh, you work in aging, you just do one thing. But actually, our work covers every part of the human condition. It's a universal experience for most part, is aging. We all grow old, most of us anyway. And the work that we do around employment, around the Halle Orchestra, around talking to people from different parts of the world, around the design of a footbridge, whatever it is, we have something to say about everything. And what a great career that is. And you work with inspiring older people who model your behavior or one's behavior as well. So we need to recruit more people to the cause, to the, you know, this wonderful careers that we have. And I think that's the thing that I'd like to end on. It's a wonderful, wonderful life doing this work. And you should never take it for granted.
Look, Paul, I think that the last phrase, never take it for granted, is something that we need to start with every day and finish with every day. Because what we know, Paul, is that around the world we have family, oddly enough. And they may not be kin, but they're pretty close to kin. And so I thank you very much for being with us today. And also to Joe and to Polly, who have been populating the chat box. Your details and all of the information around connections to the GM Aging Hub. And I encourage everybody to actually re-look at this video, which is going to be posted, but also, you know, just be curious and inquiring around the GM Aging Hub. And I'm coming, Paul, to do the mods and rocks, all right, to Manchester. So thank
always welcome.
Good. And as we just move into the last couple of minutes, I'd like to encourage you all to submit an abstract, you know, to be part of our conference in Bangkok, 27th to the 30th of June. age-friendly environments is certainly one of those themes. It's an in-person event because I cannot have any more of my hair torn out through a virtual event. So join with us. If you've got any inquiries, please just make contact with me and we'll tell you a little bit more about it in the weeks and months to come. So stay safe, stay well. Thank you for being with us. To my colleagues at IFA, Bruna, Jasmine, and the entire team, thank you for helping me make me who I am. So be well, Paul. Take good care. Bye.